Before we get to factoring out the GCF from a polynomial, let's continue with one more example of finding the GCF. This time we have a mixture of both numbers and variables. So we would approach this, well, we know how to do it for numbers, we know how to do it for variables, so we approach it for each one and do each one individually. So we look at the numbers 24, 18, and 20, and we figure out what would go into each of them. Sometimes you may need to use that division method, other times just kind of approach it and see what happens. In this case, it's not too hard to see that the only thing you can take out of each of those numbers is a 2. And then we approach the variables. X shows up in every one of them. Smallest power is an x to the first. Y shows up in every one of them. Smallest power is a y to the first. Z shows up only one time, so therefore he has to be left out. So our GCF is 2xy. We now begin to get ready to talk about factoring the GCF. To factor the GCF, the key is understanding a very important property of numbers that you'll hear me talk about many, many times throughout the course of this semester, and that is something called the distributive property. Distributive property simply states that if you have a multiplication problem alongside an addition problem, then the multiplication can distribute over the addition problem. It also can be taken in reverse. In other words, if you have some common thing being multiplied in an addition problem, then you can pull that or factor out that that expression. And that's exactly what we're going to do with the distributive property. That's exactly how we're going to factor using the distributive property. Consider the expression 4x squared plus 20x. As we look at those two pieces, 4x squared and 20x, we can conclude to ourselves that the GCF for 4 and 20 would be 4, and for x squared and x would be an x. So now we can take that 4x squared plus 20x, and we can rewrite that now as 4x times x plus 4x times 5. Right, just rewriting the 4x squared and the 20x. And then we see that we have a common thing being multiplied in each one of those pieces. And so by the distributive property, that piece, that 4x, can be taken out. And so we can factor this as 4x times x plus 5. And that's just strictly using our distributive property of taking that expression 4x and pulling it out using the distributive property. And so that's how factoring the GCF works. Now in practice, we usually transition from this step to this step. We usually don't rewrite it, and it's by factoring each term first. But I've done it this time so you can see how that distributive property allows us to do that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong if you want to do that for your first couple of problems, just to, make sure you kind of understand and grasp what's going on. Okay, so that's how we factor out the GCF, and now we're just going to look at some more examples. So consider the following example: 42x cubed y squared minus 24x squared y cubed. Okay, so we begin by looking at the numbers. So let's first find our GCF. So 42 and 24, we look at those and say, well, 6, after a little bit of thought, 6 will go into both of those. We can also pull off an x squared. So x shows up in both. The smallest is an x squared. And we have a y cubed and a y squared, so we can pull out a y squared. Now there's really two ways that you can approach this, at least two different ways. You may come up with a third. That you can now approach this as far as, how do I do the factoring step? I found the GCF, how do I do the factoring step? Well, you can approach it as follows. We can ask the question, 6x squared y squared times what would give me 42 x cubed y squared. And we just kind of fill in the blank. And we do the same thing for the other part. So in this case, we can say, well, 6 times 7, right, would give me 42. X squared times x would give me x cubed. And I already have the y squared. And so we can do that same thing for the other one. Ask the question of, what do I multiply by? And so we ask the question of, what do I multiply by? So once again we say 6x squared y squared times what would give me 24 x squared y cubed. And again we fill in the blank. Well, 6 times 4 would give me 24. We already have the x squared, we need a y, so it would be 4y. And then we just put it all together. We've done the two pieces. So now we just put it all together. Here's our GCF, 6x squared y squared. And then we fill in what we found, 7x minus 4y. The minus is coming in because that 24 x squared y cubed was negative. And so now we have our answer. Okay, so we're going to continue with some more examples in the next videos of factoring out the GCF.